Welcome back, everyone. This is the fourth and final workshop in this Building Our Power series. My name, as you know, is Argo. You will remember Becky, who leads on the Sunrise Project's work in the UK, and we're going to facilitate this workshop together. We're going to talk practically today about how we might use some of the insights that we've gained from this workshop series. We have got a fantastic panel on the line who are going to suggest some possible ways activists could direct their energies, in the kind of weeks and months to come. Originally, we'd asked Platform, who are an organisation based in London, who work on climate change, on social justice, to send somebody along to our panel. And we had some really good chats with them about it. But in the end, they actually decided that they didn't want to take part. And the reasons, and me and Becky both thought that the reasons for it were super interesting, and we wanted to share them with you. Just take a few minutes to do that. Because it's an interesting and important perspective, and it will probably help frame some of the other stuff we talk about today. Platform felt concerned about the framing of these workshops around COVID-19 as a crisis. We've talked about that a lot, right? Because the thing is, if you're used to living in a state of relative prosperity and stability, COVID-19 is a huge event. But by calling this pandemic out as a special sort of crisis, we kind of ignore the fact the majority of the world has been enduring one crisis after another for a very long time. In the UK, there's been a soaring increase in people living in poverty and precarious conditions in recent years, especially working class people and people of colour. And around the world, for many people, this pandemic is just the latest in a series of social, economic and environmental catastrophes that have unfolded over generations. Catastrophes with roots in centuries of exploitation of local labour and natural resources for the benefit of a few, especially in the West. If we want our activism to be effective, we maybe have to kind of zoom out and try to see all the complex, interconnected things that were already wrong before COVID-19. That means not just thinking about fossil fuels and biodiversity, but also the ways that our systems are organised to exploit and take away power from entire communities. There is no way to create a peaceful, sustainable world without ending inequality, injustice, and racism. How do we do that? Well, one place to start is by giving power and platforms to people whose lives have been shaped by these forces. Now, we've managed that to some extent in this workshop series, but one thing we'd do differently in future is to build in more time to make sure our speakers come from as wide and diverse a range of backgrounds as possible. So, if you'd like to learn more about how you might bring this wider perspective to how you think about working on climate change and economic justice, drop us an email at buildingourpower@gmail.com. And Platform also wanted to say, like Rob over there, that they wish us all the best for these workshops, and they're really excited to hear that they've gone well, and they send their love. So I will end on that cheerful note. I'll hand over to Becky because it's time at last for our pitches. Yes!
Thanks, Argo. Really appreciate that. I've got the real privilege to introduce our panel today, who are really excited can join us. So far, we've looked at crisis and how we can respond to it. We've looked at our economic system and our financial system in more time. And now we've got the great opportunity to think about what we can do about it, how we can take action. We've got the fantastic Leila Deen, who until a few weeks ago was Programme Director of Some of Us, now as a consultant working on response to COVID. And before that was at Greenpeace UK and Greenpeace US for a long time. But Leila also was an activist and has her roots in activism. She was involved in Plain Stupid and Climate Camp, so she'll have lots of ideas for action. We have Juman Kubba, who works for Greenpeace UK in their political unit. We have Farbrother, who's an activist from Extinction Rebellion, but also a civil servant as well as their main day job. And we have Rajiv Joshi, who is too many things to list here. Currently is director at Bridging Ventures and also a special advisor to Mission 2020 and the B Team. So the person who's going to go first is Leila. So over to you, Leila.
I state the obvious when I say that this moment has revealed the best and the worst of human nature and the systems that we've built around our society. And when we look at COVID and what's happened, we can see the opportunities that we can see that there is everybody sort of screaming out for this kind of large scale transformation of society. And yet sort of saying that is one thing and actually trying to deliver that is going to be a whole different kettle of fish. And I think in the last few weeks, it's become apparent that, you know, our force, our movement is but one of many forces and movements that are really trying to take this opportunity. And we have to be really conscious of that. So as Becky said, I'm Leila. I've been a direct action activist for years. I spent 11 years at Greenpeace, first in the US, in the UK for 6 years, and then in the US. And I shifted into climate change work from a focus on global poverty and global inequality after I saw how all the things that we had been campaigning for throughout the kind of, you know, the 80s and 90s around aid conditionality, third world debt and neoliberalism at large, all of those gains would be fundamentally undermined by climate change. And those that would be affected would be those that have done least to cause it. So right now, as Becky mentioned, I'm starting to work with alongside the UN, looking at how COVID also is potentially another one of those risks, that it will not only reinvigorate xenophobia and misinformation, but also impact first and worst on the poorest countries. But also because they see at the international level a real opportunity and necessity to reinvigorate the concept of multilateralism and the power of collective effort. So I wanted to reflect a little bit on, as per the question, because I like to do my homework correctly, I wanted to reflect on the last time we saw these sorts of dynamics at play. And of course, 2008, the economic crash that happened then comes to mind. So I was a campaigner and a direct activist before that, and, you know, got arrested 5, 6, 7 times trying to move forward towards the sort of Copenhagen climate summits and the, you know, making the what was eventually the Paris Agreement. And we did make great progress here in the UK. But the thing that I feel that we really missed that time round was we failed to create broad enough public support that we could sustain when an economic crisis hit. There was a sense that there was a separation between caring about climate change and the environment and caring about where the next, you know, where our jobs are going to come from and the stability of our economy. And we as a climate movement, I don't think, built a strong enough constituency nor a strong enough case for those most affected by the economic collapse to be prioritised. And instead, those people, instead of seeing the green economic transition as an opportunity, those communities increased their support for populism and nationalism. And we all know how that went with Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, Brexit, you know, the UK Conservative movement. And throughout all of that, a real withdrawal of collective effort, collective enterprise and multilateralism. So it's obvious where I'm going with this. We're now in another moment where the parallels are stark with that time. And I do think that we, as a climate movement, are in a better place than we were last time. But I'm left wondering, have we built enough support? Have we broadened the concern enough within those communities that are first and worst impacted both internationally and nationally? Are we speaking as one voice across classes around the need for the recovery to be a green one? If you're losing your job, if you're risking your well-being, if your livelihood is threatened, are you going to feel that a green transition is in your interests? And I think that's where I'd like us to have a conversation today. And I guess I would ask the question of the movement, of the climate movement, are we genuinely up for being in solidarity with the poorest people, both in rich countries and poor countries? Are we really willing to fight for them? And that's why I know we're going to hear much more about Build Back Better from Juman, and I'm really excited to hear the sorts of details on that, because I think that's the right trajectory. I think that green groups have to be really upfront and really vocal and proactive in fighting alongside those who have lost out through this this recent pandemic. And I think we have to be really careful not to seem insincere or transactional around that. So I think, you know, in some senses, what you've mentioned, Argo, around platforms position, I agree with that. We have to make sure that we are doing that. And also, just as in 2008, we need to look at the wider picture, not just kind of the opportunities for moving climate forward. So there's now a huge amount of corporations who have, you know, slightly belatedly, but nonetheless, and identified this as an opportunity to start to profit from our catastrophe. And you'll have seen Naomi Klein's recent Guardian piece highlighting the power being accumulated, particularly by tech companies in this crisis. Maybe this doesn't seem like a climate issue, but it is. She says, in the midst of the carnage of this ongoing pandemic and the fear and uncertainty about the future it's brought, tech companies are seeing their moment to sweep out the democratic engagement that the public, that we have. And then she goes on to sort of mention that this is a battle by big tech companies to receive government money that would be spent otherwise in the public sector. She says if tech companies win their ferocious lobbying campaign for remote learning, for telehealth, 5G and driverless vehicles, which she calls the Screen New Deal, there won't be any money left over for public provisions like the Green New Deal that our planet urgently needs. And on the contrary, the prices of those things will go up. And so there's obviously a wealth of opportunities under that kind of general heading of kind of disaster capitalism. And I think if we want to build back better, we also have to engage in a defensive battle, making sure that those corporations don't seize that space. So some campaign ideas we could talk about today include the bailouts, but not just green strings attached, but also how are banks going to pay back to society that we can fund those that have lost out through this, through losing their jobs or losing their ability to survive. There's also a movement by the London Renters Union to create a mass rent strike. That's something I think environmental communities should be in solidarity with, and to improve labour laws within the gig economy. And then also, I think there's a real opportunity for ideas around wage caps or share caps for high earners and maybe on corporate profits. We've seen that, Jeff Bezos, Amazon is their revenue is $11,000 a second, right? So by the end of a sentence, like how much money has that company made? And this can't continue. And it certainly can't continue when we see the public sphere just so depleted of resources. Not to mention the impact that these companies like Facebook, Amazon, Google, and YouTube are having on our democracy. I think green groups need to be able to be seen as part of those conversations and championing those sorts of campaigns so that there's a sense that green and climate work is integrated into an economic framework and that it's essential for the functioning of society. And then the last thing, I hope I'm not well over time, but no one's pinged me. I wanted to point out the difference between now and 2008 and the opportunity that I really think it affords us. As much as we are seeing the dark side of humanity come out, we're also seeing the bright side. And this too offers, I think, huge opportunities for organising. You might have seen Rebecca Solnit's piece in The Guardian recently about what an important opportunity this is. She says, I believe the generosity and solidarity in action that are in the present moment offer a foreshadowing of what's possible and necessary. The basic generosity and empathy of most ordinary people should be regarded as a treasure, a light, and an energy source that can drive a better society if it is recognised and encouraged. And I kind of note that that stands in like real contradiction to where I thought the general public were or how much people cared anymore sort of 5-10 years ago. We have to sort of, harness that, I think. So I'm currently writing a book about how kindness and compassion can strengthen and improve movement building and improve movement building and activism. I think it can increase empowerment. I think it can widen inclusion and understanding. And at a global scale, that means creating collective responsibility. But that's a whole other conversation about multilateralism. So just to conclude, I believe we can seize on this collective spirit and the awakening of people to our independent nature and the independence of our society, that there is such thing as society, to engage people in local and community change that can be scaled up to the global. Obviously, the mutual aid networks have been hugely successful, and I'm aware that XR is planning on using a model that's inspired, I think, by the Argentinian popular assemblies. You'll all know more about that than I do. To organise around climate in local communities. And I would say this is the right direction, but again, I want to really underline that we environmentalists must genuinely throw a lot in with those suffering in this moment, especially if we want them to sort of listen to the cause that we're trying to speak about. We need to take a lead from their concerns and show true solidarity with the struggles of those living precariously. And if we can do that, I think we can expand and embed a transition to rapid climate action.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting. And yeah, I think I can pick up on a few of the themes that you've talked about there. But before I get into it, I just want to set the scene a little bit. I'm from Extinction Rebellion. I've been involved since the declaration at Parliament that was October 2018. And I've, like most people in Extinction Rebellion, and there's a few people here I recognise, so it's really nice to see your faces. Most of us are volunteers, so we do this weekends and evenings, but yeah, hours and hours have gone into this. For me, my role has been mostly around non-violent direct action training, and one of the things that's really sprung out to me from learning about that tradition is the range of tactics available within that school of activism. So it's always been a belief that in XR we've only really scratched the surface of what's possible with direct action, and the reality is that when we're together, we have so much power, and people haven't yet realised that. So I think we've all seen what has happened with XR. So we got a lot of attention. We changed the conversation. But sadly, nothing really happened. So the government declared a climate emergency. Parliament declared a climate emergency, but there's not really been any significant action. So we really are in the shit, and I think that's the kind of the perspective that what I'm about to talk about will make sense in. So a couple of other caveats. The decision-making process within Extinction Rebellion is quite complicated, and nothing has yet been decided. So everything that I'm talking about at the moment is actually still in flux, and I believe it will happen, but it might not. So take that as a caveat. So yeah, Money Rebellion is there's a team of us working on it, and it's been an idea that's been around since, I think people have been working on it for about 10 years, pre-XR, and then Gail Bradbrook, who probably I expect most of you know, has been talking about a debt strike since very early on in Extinction Rebellion. The idea is that it's our economic system and financial institutions that we're also up against. So if you look at our declaration that we originally made, it was against the government. We're in open rebellion against the government and the corrupt and inept institutions that threaten our future. So we focused a lot on the government, but I think some of our actions around financial institutions haven't had a very clear and coherent narrative. So I know that some of my colleagues have been to the previous sessions here and talked a bit about the financial system. And I'm here to talk about the action, where we are, the thinking on our kind of description of the economic system. So the key points are, our economic system is based on this idea that you can have infinite growth in a finite planet, which I think is becoming like an emperor's new clothes like situation, where so many of us can see that that doesn't make sense or is driving us to destruction, but the act of actually calling it out hasn't been made very clearly yet. The second point is that profit for the few is more important than purposely serving the many. And I think we've seen that with the equity issues that have been discussed already. So our economic system prioritizes creating and meeting consumer demand rather than serving people's needs. We also have deep corruption, which has a massive role in distorting our democracy. So as a response to that, Money Rebellion seeks truth-telling about our economic problems while taking ideological positions for or against any specific named economic system. So it's this non-ideological pragmatism that you're probably familiar if you're familiar with XR. So a lot of the work that's going on at the moment is around taking our XR demands and bringing them into the now. So we need to tell the truth about our economic system, and this involves also telling the truth to ourselves. So about our role in this and our privileged position within a corrupt global structure. The second demand is to act now. So there's a lot we can do around our economy to sort out our climate and ecological emergency. I won't go into all of the details now because I'm sure it's familiar to most of you here. And then the final demand remains the same. So we want to rewire humanity with citizens' assemblies. So this relates to our non-ideological position. We want to hand power back to people and make decisions collectively with democracy. And that's in opposition to this pathway towards fascism that we're probably on. Yeah, so in terms of the actions themselves, we're talking about financial actions. So this could be a whole range of different things. There's a really wide spectrum of possible actions. The one that I think is the most developed is this idea around debt disputes. So this is a very minimal risk to participants. So there is a spectrum of risk that people are willing to take, and debt dispute is legal, and we are able to do it. We're able to dispute our debts on basis of the Serious Fraud Act 2007, which provides a legal basis for us refusing to pay any organisation that is committing ecological offences. So this could be HSBC, Barclays, the government. It's been tested against the government, and it hasn't yet been tested in court, but there is a legal basis for making that argument. There's also groups talking about taking out overdrafts, credit cards, and basically moving the money to where it's needed. So it's going into consumer debt, risking a bad credit reference, a bad credit score, and dealing with the consequences. So the logic is that who's going to need a credit score on a dead planet? We're also supporting rent strikes that are going on at the moment. We're expecting this tidal wave of debt defaults. It's really important that I think the climate movement, including Extinction Rebellion, stands in solidarity with those that genuinely aren't going to be able to pay their debts. And the view is, we don't owe a system that is destroying the planet very much. So we should be standing in solidarity with those that are choosing food over paying their rent, for example. I think the next steps for this are for this project we're still in a development stage, so we're really trying to get messaging right about how we do link our debt-based economy to the climate and ecological crisis. I kind of think if we can clearly explain that link, then that's half the battle. We've got a big team already, but we're looking for more people to come and join and get this out, because we're looking to go well beyond Extinction Rebellion and the existing climate movement. This is a mass mobilization movement, and it's incredibly ambitious, but it seems our best chance given the circumstances that we're up against.
Thanks, Leila and Will, for setting things out so clearly. I think given time, I'm just going to focus on practical things that people can do, explain a little bit about Build Back Better and opportunities there. I'll mention briefly what Greenpeace is doing and ways that people can engage there as well. And then if there's time, there's a couple of thoughts I have just on the international side from my personal background, which I'll share, but we'll see how the time goes. So firstly, Build Back Better. It sounds like you've already discussed this in previous meetings, but just to quickly go over what that is. Basically, it's following on from what Leila had said earlier on. We all recognise that we are in the midst of a massive government intervention, which will set the scene for the next decade. And if we basically have an opportunity to try and intervene in that and shape that, or we're going to be left dealing with what things look like without having controlled it in any way. And we know from 2008 that lots of groups, lots of individuals working disparately doesn't really have an impact. And so Build Back Better was set up to try and build bridges, deal with gaps, and kind of create this collective movement. I should say at this point, I'm not here as a Build Back Better representative, but Greenpeace is one of the groups that's part of it, so I can just explain it from that perspective. So Build Back Better is not a formal coalition. Deliberately, it's seen as coalitions are kind of too restrictive and they can be quite limiting. This was more about getting a mix of players who can work together collaboratively and complement each other. It includes kind of big organisations like Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, RSPCA, working with the likes of the trade unions, and then particularly groups that are in the sharp end of both the COVID crisis, so people working on things like healthcare and migrant rights, and of climate justice, which often cross over. The idea of Build Back Better is to try and get people working together on 3 key issues. Firstly, meeting people's immediate needs, what investment in public services needs to look like, and then in the longer term, transforming the economy to be fair, sustainably and globally just. So in the way many of us think of it, we're looking at what's kind of a green just recovery look like and how can we, as a group, try and do that. In terms of how it's doing it, there's a small piece of work which is around sort of specifics of economics, which groups like New Economic Foundation are developing, and that's interesting worth being aware of. But the bigger piece is much more about the narrative and trying to get to people who don't normally engage. So people who don't normally understand the links to climate, just because they're dealing with so many crises, so many issues of their own, that they don't necessarily have the headspace to think about it, or haven't understood or sort of had the time to sort of think about the connection. So it's trying to reach those kinds of people and show how things are linked. So, for example, how a well-resourced healthcare system is really important, not just for COVID, but also for a future climate crisis, the same issue. And also how inequality links into impacts of COVID, impacts of climate, that these are all part of the same thing. And there's a lot more there in terms of kind of gaps that we know exist between different groups and just trying to bridge them. So in terms of where things are with that grouping, it was launched last week. It was deliberately launched on International Nurses Day, kicking off with videos of nurses explaining what Build Back Better means to them, which I think sets the scene for what it's trying to do. It's trying to bring together different voices. And there's now a website, and I'll be sharing details with Argo and Becky afterwards, and they can pass it on to all of you. But basically, if you want to sign on to Build Back Better through that, that's your opportunity. And then going forward, there's going to be things like virtual rallies. There's a series of webinars starting to explore different kinds of issues in a bit more detail. There's local engagement starting. So you've got the likes of Green New Deal UK, which is starting to sort of engage and help people to sort of vocalize this need to Build Back Better, just simple things like putting signs up. And then if you have more time and you want to volunteer, then there's a real opening for that. They're just looking for a lot of people to come in and share their ideas, share their skills. So if that's something you've got time for, if you've got like a day a week or a few hours a week, just get in touch through the email or through Facebook and just offer what time you have, and then there'll be things that you could do, and that's a really nice way to get involved and also help to shape what Build Back Better does. And then there's also sort of linked to this plans for later in the year for June, July, mass mobilisation. So lots going on, and we can talk about it more in the small groups. So that's Build Back Better. In terms of Greenpeace, very quickly, I don't know what people may have seen. We've sort of been working most immediately on stuff that's happening right now. So things like the bailouts, the aviation bailouts, and trying to push those in the right direction. And as part of that, we're also doing sort of local work, including people going to their constituency MPs and pushing them and just showing that we care. And so if you're interested in that, again, there's opportunity to sort of engage in those sorts of things, depending on what your interests are. We're also developing sort of very concrete policy recommendations, which we'll be sharing around things like transport, and there'll be more work off the back of that. And then bigger campaigns, again, around green recovery. But for us, because we do so much work around film and like social media, we'll be using those platforms just to get the message out. And our hope is that this all helps to underline and support the work that Build Back Better is doing. And I think that's the hope for all of it, is that we have green groups working on social justice, working with international groups, that we all cumulatively have an impact and we're really on the same page. So that's a really quick intro to everything that's going on. And the final thing I'll say is just thinking about the things that Platform said, that Leila was talking about and Will mentioned. I mean, I should say my background, I'm originally from Iraq. So, you know, I know firsthand issues around conflicts, issues around natural resource exploitation, all of that. And my background pre-Greenpeace was working directly on corruption, conflicts and natural resources in Asia, Africa, other parts of the world, and I've seen just what it means. I think there's two things to be aware of that I just wanted to point to from this. Firstly, we have a government that's already picked up the climate thing. They're already using the language of climate, and I think that's something we need to be thinking about, because there's a real risk of greenwashing with whatever we do. And so it's really important that as we go forward, we're really aware of that and we're asking the right challenging questions. I think the other part of it is, as the UK moves forward, particularly in like Brexit and the new trade approach, we're potentially a leverage point for the UK to play an extremely damaging role, more so than it's done in the past. I mean, it's already extremely damaging, but it could be even worse depending on where it moves things. And I think that's the other thing just for us to think about. It's partly about what we're doing within the UK, but also what's the UK doing on the international stage, and how can we push against those forces so that we're not actively contributing to harm in places that just can't deal with more harm than we're dealing with.
We're at a really critical moment, aren't we? We are, many of us are going around like this in our, neighborhoods, and I don't think it's sunk in as deeply as it needs to how much of an inflection point that we are really in. And in some ways, there are three concurrent things happening at once, from what I can see. And like the panelists that have spoken before me, I think I have also had the privilege of listening to many different groups trying to coalesce at various levels, in globally, amongst institutions, amongst activists, amongst leaders, governments trying to figure out what to do, individuals that helped pull together the Paris Agreement, all trying to figure out what is it that we need to be doing right now. And in a way, there's the first phase that we're in right now is one of rescue. And many of us are deeply connected to the reality that there are hundreds of thousands of people who have lost their lives, that there are so many communities that have been affected by the current crisis, that this crisis is only illustrating for us the type of crises that we can expect to see more and more of as we go into a decisive decade, where not only climate change will compound, but the fact that we have a deepening level of inequality, and the fact that we have 500 million people likely to fall back below the poverty line as a result of this crisis is going to create a very, very vulnerable social fabric within which all of this is taking place. So we are in a mode of rescue, and many organizations that we work closely with, and many people in their local communities are thinking about what can we do to support those on the front lines, and also to support in this rescue phase. But we're also in a recovery phase, and people are planning for the recovery, recognizing that we need to also recover certain parts of the system to be able to function and to keep our species and our civilization moving, even if that is on life support. And that's why we're seeing the greatest amount of resources channeled into our economic system than has ever been channeled before. As our economies are on their knees, $20 trillion of capital is being amassed all over the world, and how that money gets spent and what happens with that money over the next 12 months, in a way, is going to make a difference about whether or not we win or lose in the decisive decade. And therefore, it's not just about the long run transformation, but actually, in fact, it's about what we're doing in the next 12 months to put the right conditionalities on some of that money to make sure that it helps us to transform the system, not just to make incremental changes which are rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, so to say. And thirdly, we're also in a mode of redesign. And many of us are thinking about the fact that it's not necessarily a return to business as usual. And that in fact, we aren't going back to another normal. And in fact, perhaps it's not about building back, because we can't put things back the way they were. And what do we mean by build? And what do we mean by back? And what do we mean by better? And so there's some of us who are also, trying to figure out that while we want to create alignment and coalesce around a narrative, how do we make sure that that narrative also works for the world and works for the problems that we're trying to solve for? And is there a way in which we can ensure that we are also redefining success and redefining the underlying problems of our economic system in terms of how we're currently defining success, so that we are getting into those issues around how we treat ourselves, how we measure progress, how companies operate, the purpose of a company, those types of questions. And for me, I think one of the most striking messages that I had to read that I thought was really interesting was from Arundhati Roy, who was really calling on us to imagine the future. And she said, whatever it is, coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists, and in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our own prejudice and hatred and avarice, our databanks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with light luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And I think that that is the call to action. That is the challenge to our movement, that we need to imagine a different future and we need to start redesigning the system, because that system is not working for us. It's not working for our planet. And we have to really come together in a totally different way across movements. And that's the type of work that we're engaged in.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists today and to all of you for participating today and in previous weeks.